So we're going to factor. First, we're going to factor 6x squared minus 7x minus 5. We're going to factor by grouping, or the AC method. So let me give you a little bit of background. This is ax squared plus bx plus c. That's the general form we're looking for. So this is compared to this, and we're going to figure out what a, b, and c are for this example. A is 6 because it's the coefficient of x squared. B is negative 7, it's the coefficient of x. And c is negative 5, it's the constant. So we're going to factor by grouping. As I said, we're going to find the AC product, which is a times c. That's 6 times negative 5, which is negative 30. Then we're going to write all of the factors of 30. We'll get to the negative sign in a second. Just ignore it for now. 1 and 30. These are natural number factors. 2 and 15, 3 and 10. Okay, and then we know that 2 is a factor of 30. If we double 2, we would have to take 15 and divide by 2. Double this and half this. Well, 15 is not even, so we know 4 is not a factor. And then we keep going. 5 times 6. And you notice this kind of makes a horseshoe. We end up, 6 is the next integer, so we know we can't factor anymore. So let's go back to our original problem and talk about what the signs tell us. So this third sign is going to be really helpful. The third sign is negative, and if it's negative, it tells us several things. First off, it's going to tell us that when we end up factoring, that our signs in our parentheses are different, okay? It also tells us we are going to subtract to get the middle term. So signs are going to be different because we had a minus, so that's where the minus 30, this minus. If you look, the middle term is also negative. So that means in our factors, we're going to use a negative for the bigger number. Okay, so negative for the bigger number. We're going to use a positive for the smaller numbers. And then we're going to combine them. Now this said we were going to subtract to get the middle term. But notice if I have two numbers and I'm combining them, one is positive, one is negative, I'm actually subtracting. So positive 1 minus 30, that's the same as 30 minus 1, and then use the sign of the 30. So this is negative 29. Negative 2 minus 15, that's the same as 15 minus 2, which is 13, and then use the negative sign. 3 minus 10, that's the same as 10 minus 3, and use the sign of the bigger one, which is negative, negative 7. And 5 minus 6 is negative 1. So then we go back right here and we say, well, negative 7x, we're going to rewrite that in terms of 3x minus 10x. So we're going to rewrite this, 6x squared plus 3x minus 10x minus 5. Does that make sense? So this negative 7x is written in terms of those two values. Now we're going to factor by grouping. We're going to group the first two pieces together, and we're going to group the back two together. So 6x squared plus 3x, we're going to factor out the greatest common factor of those two. Well, they both have 3 and they both have an x. So then we say 3x times what gives me 6x squared? 2x. And 3x times what gives me positive 3x plus 1. Let's just distribute this just to make sure. 3x times 2x, that's 6x squared. 3x times 1 plus 3x. We're good. Then we do the same thing in the back. In the back, we say, what do those two have in common? We have a negative 10x minus 5. You may be tempted to say there's a 5 in common. And then 5 times what is negative 10x? Negative 2x. And 5 times what is negative 5? Negative 1. And while this is certainly true, that is one way to factor this. When you factor by grouping, you want the things that are remaining in these sets of parentheses back here and back here to be exactly the same, and they're not. But if you notice, this is positive 2x, that's a negative 2x. That's a positive 1, that's a negative 1. If we change what we factor out and we factor out a negative 5 instead, we're going to get the same thing. So negative 5 times what is negative 10x? 2x. Negative 5 times what is negative 5? Plus 1. Does that make sense? So you see now that this and this are the same. Let's go over here. If we were going to factor 3x times m minus 5 times m, we could say, well, they both have an m, right? So you'd have m times 3x minus 5. But look here, I have 3x times, instead of m, I have 2x plus 1, and negative 5 times 2x plus 1. So look at this. 3x times something green minus 5 times something green. 3x times something green minus 5 times something green. You factor out the green, right? So what we're going to do is factor out the piece they both have in common, which is the 2x plus 1. I'll write that right here. And then we say we have 3x minus 5 left over. So 3x minus 5, that goes the second set of parentheses. Same thing over here. 3x minus 5 went here. I do want to point out that this also can be factored as 3x minus 5 times 2x plus 1. If you had factored this, written down the 3x minus 5 first, you still get the same thing. Okay, let's try another one. Factor negative 6x squared plus 17x minus 5. So we're going to look at this and say we'll have x squared, x, and a constant. And then we say, can we factor something out of all three terms? No. But it would be really helpful if the coefficient of x squared was positive. So let's factor out a negative 1. So negative 1, then we get 6x squared minus 17x plus 5. And now let's look inside this. This is called the depressed polynomial. Let's look at that depressed polynomial. And let's look at a, b, and c. A is 6, b is negative 17, and c is 5. We're going to find the AC product. So we do 6 times 5, which is 30. Well, we found all the factors of 30 just a minute ago, didn't we? So 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 5 and 6. Okay, but now let's look at the third sign. So now the third sign is positive. So it's going to tell us a couple of things. Signs in the parentheses are the same. And we're going to use the middle sign. Okay, and then we're going to add to get the middle term. So I'm going to use the middle sign, which is a negative. So that means here I'm going to make everything negative. I have negative 1 and a negative 30. I'm combining them. So that's like 1 plus 30, which is 31, but then I have a negative sign. Negative 2 minus 15, we add the numbers. So 2 plus 15 is 17, and then we use the sign they both have. Negative 3 minus 10, we're going to add the numbers. We get 13, and we use the sign they both have. Negative 5 minus 6, well 5 plus 6 is 11, but they're both negative, so we have negative 11. We wanted negative 17. So negative 17x means we're going to consider the one that when we combine these values, we get negative 17. So we still have this negative 1 out front, but we're going to rewrite this as 6x squared minus 2x minus 15x plus 5. So we've replaced negative 17x with negative 2x minus 15x. So we see that we've taken this trinomial and we've actually rewritten it as a polynomial with 4 terms. Now we're going to factor by grouping. We're going to group the first 2 terms together, and we're going to group the back 2 terms together. So we're going to have this negative 1 out front. We have 6x squared minus 2x. What do those have in common? What is the greatest common factor? 2x. 2x times what is 6x squared? 3x. And then 2x times what is negative 2x minus 1. Then we do the same thing in the back. Negative 15x plus 5, the greatest common factor is 5. But be very careful. Remember what we did up here. We factored out a negative so that we would get the same thing factored in each set of parentheses. If we factor out a positive 5, 5 times 3 is 15, so we would need a negative 3 in the parentheses. So if we did a positive 5, we did a negative 3 right here. And we see that's the opposite sign. So we're going to change this, and we're going to factor again a negative 5. Negative 5 times positive 3x gives us negative 15x. And then negative 5 times a negative 1 gives me a positive 5. Okay? And then we're going to look at what do these two things have in common. They both have a 3x minus 1. Okay, so we're going to rewrite this negative 1 out here. We're going to rewrite the factor they have in common, which is the 3x minus 1. And then we're going to read off the rest, and that's going to go in the second set of parentheses back here. So 2x minus 5. And again, keep in mind, as I said a few minutes ago, negative 1 times 2x minus 5 times 3x minus 1 is also mathematically correct. Okay? So let's look at these two examples for just a moment and compare them. I said when I looked at the third sign that it told me lots of things. The third sign, negative, said signs in parentheses are different. So when we actually factored it, yes, the signs in the parentheses ended up being different. And we subtracted, we saw that here. We subtracted the numbers and used the sign of the bigger number. And here we said this third sign, positive, told us signs in the parentheses when we finished factoring would be the same, and they are, they're both negative. And then we added to get the middle term. We added and we kept the sign that they both had. Okay, let's try another one. Factor 5x squared plus 17x minus 40. So we have x squared and x in a constant, and there's no greatest common factors that we can factor out of all three terms. So we're going to find a, b, and c. A is 5, b is 17, c is negative 40. We look for the AC product. That's negative 200. Again, we'll talk about the negative in just a minute. 1 and 200, 2 and 100, 3 doesn't go, 4 and 50, 5 and 40. 6 does not go and is a factor because 3 is not a factor. Okay, 7 doesn't go either. We know 8 is a factor because 4 times 50 is. If we double 4, we get 8. That means we have to take this and multiply by 1/2 or divide by 2. 25. 9 is not a factor because 3 wasn't a factor. 10 and 20. 11 is not a factor. 12 is not a factor because 3 is not a factor. 13 is not a factor. 14 is not a factor because 7 is not a factor. 15 is not a factor because 3 is not a factor. 16 is not a factor because we would have to double 8 and then divide 25 by 2, and you can't do that. 17 is not a factor. 18 is not a factor because 9 is not a factor. 19 is not a factor, so we have everything. Third sign is negative, so when we get done factoring, signs in our parentheses are going to be different. Okay, and we are going to subtract to get the middle number. Okay, and when we look at this plus right here, the middle sign is positive. So the bigger number, the bigger factor, is positive. So we're going to plus this all right here. And we're going to put negatives on the other ones because we're going to subtract. We're going to combine the values. If you have combined two numbers where one's positive, one's negative, you're actually subtracting and using the sign of the bigger one. Negative 1 plus 200, that's like 200 minus 1, 199. Negative 2 plus 100, that's like 100 minus 2, 98. Negative 4 plus 50, that's like 50 minus 4, 46. Negative 5 plus 40, that's like 40 minus 5, 35. Negative 8 plus 25, that's like 25 minus 8, that's 17. And negative 10 plus 20, that's like 20 minus 10, which is 10. And we found our positive 17. We factor by grouping. We group the first two together and we group the second two together. What do the first two pairs have in common? Well, we have 5x squared minus 8x. The greatest common factor is an x. X times what is 5x squared? 5x. X times what is negative 8x? So negative 8. Then we look at the back two. 25x minus 40. The greatest common factor of those is a positive 5. 5 times 5x is 25x, and 5 times negative 8 is negative 40. Oh, look! These match. Wonderful. So we rewrite that. 5x minus 8. And then we look at the rest of it, and that's what we put in this other set of parentheses. X plus 5. So that's how you factor that one. Okay?